I still remember the smell of fresh cedar that summer, the kind of scent that makes you believe the world is good and simple. My little backyard was my kingdom, a rectangle of soft grass surrounded by fences that all looked exactly the same. Every morning, I'd step out barefoot, coffee in hand, feeling the dew soak into the wood of the back porch I'd built myself. The neighborhood looked like a commercial for conformity. Beige houses, manicured hedges, identical mailboxes standing like suburban soldiers. I didn't mind. I'd bought this place because it was safe, quiet, and boring. I was a single dad who'd had enough excitement in my 20s, and all I wanted now was a stable patch of earth where my kid could laugh without hearing sirens in the distance. My son, Ben, was 8, curious, reckless, and obsessed with building things. He'd stack cushions, Lego towers, cereal boxes, anything that could become a fort. So when summer vacation rolled around, I decided to help him build something real. We called it the Sky Den. It started as a few planks nailed between 2 sturdy oak trees. By the end of the week, it had turned into a miniature frontier cabin with windows, a rope ladder, and a tiny sign Ben painted himself. No Brendas allowed. At the time, that was just an inside joke between us. Brenda lived across the street. She was the HOA president, the kind of woman who wore pastel cardigans like armor and treated the neighborhood like her personal chessboard. I'd only met her twice. Once when she welcomed me with a pamphlet titled Rules That Keep Us Neighborly, and again when she left a note asking me to kindly remove the unapproved solar lights I'd installed. I took them down because I didn't want trouble. But when Ben and I started hammering away at that tree fort, I didn't even think about HOA approval. It was a kid's project, for crying out loud. A father and son weekend adventure, something Norman Rockwell would have painted if he'd ever drawn HOA suburbia. The neighbors seemed to like it. Mrs. Patel brought lemonade and said it reminded her of her son's old fort. Mr. Harris down the street waved and said, "Looks sturdy. Good job, man." Even Brenda's husband, a quiet accountant who looked perpetually exhausted, gave me a thumbs up while mowing his perfect lawn. Every evening, Ben and I would climb up there with flashlights, tell stories, and watch the sun dip behind the cul-de-sac. For a while it felt like childhood itself had been resurrected in our backyard, until that white envelope showed up. It was tucked neatly between bills and grocery coupons, official HOA letterhead, the kind printed on heavier paper just to make the threat feel more expensive. The wording was as sterile as a hospital room. Notice of violation. Unauthorized structure detected. Homeowners are required to submit written approval for all external additions or modifications. Failure to remove said structure within 14 days will result in daily fines and potential legal action. Below that was the small, polite signature, "Sincerely, Brenda Hollingsworth, HOA President." I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I laughed, out loud, alone, standing in the kitchen with my coffee cooling beside me. It wasn't humor, it was disbelief. Ben found me a minute later holding his toy plane. "What's funny, Dad?" he asked. "Nothing, buddy," I said. "Just some adults who forgot what being a kid feels like." That night, I walked out into the yard and stared up at the tree fort, golden under the porch light. I tried to imagine it through Brenda's eyes, a rogue construction project defying the sacred beige uniformity of our cul-de-sac. Maybe she saw it as a threat, a wooden symbol of individuality. In that moment, I realized something quietly dangerous. People like Brenda don't hate chaos. They hate reminders that control is an illusion. The next morning, I found Brenda waiting at the edge of my lawn, her arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the world like twin mirrors of judgment. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, forcing a smile. "Morning," she replied crisply. "I trust you received the notice." "Oh, I received it," I said. "And I have to say it's beautifully written. You could teach Shakespeare a thing or two about drama." Her lips tightened. This isn't a joke, Mr. Clark. Structures like that pose safety risks. We have standards to maintain. It's a tree fort, not a nuclear reactor, I said. And it's for my son. Then you'll set a fine example by following the rules, she snapped, her tone polished like a courtroom gavel. You have 14 days. She turned and marched off like a general returning from battle. I stood there, dumbfounded, my coffee cooling again. The neighborhood was still, too still, as if the air itself waited to see what I'd do next. I looked back at the sky den, Ben's masterpiece, our little dream suspended between branches, and I felt something stir that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger exactly, something deeper. The quiet defiance of a man who's finally realized that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the refusal to surrender what matters. I took a sip of my now cold coffee, looked at that fort, and whispered to myself, let's see what happens when order meets imagination. Brenda didn't waste a single day. By the following afternoon, she'd managed to summon the HOA's full symphony of bureaucracy. I came home from work to find a bright yellow courtesy reminder taped to my front door, along with a copy of the same violation notice, this time underlined in red ink, as if the color made it more legal. It was astonishing how fast the HOA moved when creativity threatened uniformity. I half expected to find a SWAT team rappelling from my roof shouting, "Hands off the hammer!" Ben ran out to the yard before I could even open the door fully. "Dad, did they like the fort?" he asked, his eyes wide with innocent optimism. I didn't have the heart to tell him that Brenda had declared war on it. "They're just confused," I said. "We'll sort it out." He nodded, completely trusting me, the way only an 8-year-old can. That night, I tried to read the HOA guidelines Brenda had included. 70 pages of what I can only describe as suburban scripture. I got as far as section 4.2.7, which covered unapproved vertical recreational structures, before my brain melted. Somewhere between external appearance standards and aesthetic cohesion enforcement. I realized the entire document could be summed up in 3 words: obey or else. I almost admired the dedication. Almost. The next morning, Brenda was at it again. She stood by the mailbox wearing a pink visor and holding a clipboard, flanked by 2 of her disciples, Mrs. Peterson and that guy with the electric leaf blower who acted like a human siren every Saturday at 7 a.m. Brenda smiled like a dentist about to deliver bad news. "Good morning, Mr. Clark," she chirped. "We just wanted to remind you that the deadline to remove the structure is now 13 days. "Ah, yes. The countdown to joy," I said. "Can't wait for the fireworks." She didn't appreciate the humor. "This is a community, Mr. Clark. Rules keep it that way." "Sure," I said. "And creativity ruins it, right?" Her eyes narrowed behind those mirrored lenses. "We all agreed to maintain a certain standard when we moved in." "I don't recall agreeing to erase childhood," I muttered. Brenda tapped her clipboard. "If you refuse to comply, you'll face daily fines of $100 and potential legal escalation." Legal escalation? For a treehouse. It's a safety issue. "Brenda," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice, "if that treehouse falls, the only thing getting hurt is your sense of control." For a moment, she blinked, just once, like the system had briefly frozen. Then she straightened her visor. "You'll receive an official citation," she said flatly, and turned on her heel. Her entourage followed like obedient drones. I watched them march down the street, clipboard swaying like a sword of suburbia. That night, I sat in the sky den with Ben, watching lightning bugs flicker between the branches. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" he asked quietly. "Nah," I said, staring at the neighboring houses where every porch light burned the exact same shade of warm yellow. "We're just a little too original," he grinned. "Can I add a slide tomorrow?" "We might be pushing it," I said, but I couldn't help smiling back. Over the next week, Brenda escalated her. campaign. First came the warning letters. Then came the neighborly check-ins. People I barely knew suddenly felt compelled to remind me of community standards. One guy even quoted section numbers to me at the grocery store. It was like living inside a polite dictatorship. On day 10, a certified letter arrived. Final notice before fines commence. I stood in my kitchen, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers, and realized I'd crossed from annoyance into disbelief. They were serious. Brenda actually wanted to destroy a kid's joy in the name of aesthetic uniformity. That night, I caught sight of her pacing her driveway on the phone, whispering with that clipped efficiency of someone who treats HOA rules like scripture. And that's when I made a mistake. I waved. Just a friendly little wave. The kind that says, "I see you, neighbor." She froze, mid-sentence, glared, and stormed back inside. I didn't know it yet, but that wave would be the spark that ignited the whole suburban wildfire. 2 days later, an envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a photo, yes, an actual printed photo, of me and Ben sitting in the tree fort. Someone had clearly taken it from the sidewalk. The letter beneath it read, "Documented ongoing violation. Immediate removal required." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in anger, but in resolve. I walked out into the yard, stared up at the sky den glowing softly in the late afternoon sun, and thought, fine. You want to play games with definitions and loopholes? Let's play. Because I'd just noticed something Brenda hadn't. The tree fort wasn't technically a detached structure. The branches extended close enough to my back deck that, with a few boards and a weekend of work, I could literally connect the two. I looked at the fort. I looked at the house, and then I smiled. The kind of slow, dangerous smile that only shows up when an idea is so ridiculous it just might work. I poured myself another cup of coffee and whispered, "If they want a deck, I'll give them the best deck in this neighborhood." By the time the HOA board meeting rolled around, I was already the villain of the month. Word had spread faster than fertilizer in springtime. Neighbors whispered in driveways. Kids pointed at our tree fort like it was some forbidden monument, and Brenda strutted through it all like a suburban general preparing for battle. She'd called a special session to address what she labeled the Clark non-compliance issue. Even the title sounded like it belonged in a corporate espionage case. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige box with folding chairs and a smell like old carpet and coffee breath. I arrived 5 minutes early with a calm smile, the kind of smile you learn from years of dealing with bureaucracy. Brenda was already there, sitting behind a plastic table with a small gavel and a stack of printed bylaws big enough to stun a horse. To her right sat her loyal lieutenants, Mrs. Peterson, who always looked like she was smelling something unpleasant, and Harold, the treasurer, who stared at spreadsheets the way monks stare at scripture. "Mr. Clark," Brenda said, adjusting her glasses without looking up. "We appreciate your attendance." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I said, taking a seat in the front row. Only 3 other residents showed up, probably hoping for drama. Brenda cleared her throat and launched into the formalities. Meeting minutes, budget updates, community landscaping reports. I sat patiently, waiting for my turn under the suburban spotlight. Finally, she said the words like a judge delivering a sentence. "Next item, property violation at 1472 Willow Bend." She looked directly at me. "Mr. Clark, would you like to explain why the unauthorized structure on your property has not been removed?" I leaned forward. "Sure, because it's not unauthorized." The room went still. Harold blinked. Mrs. Peterson gasped quietly, which, for her, was practically a scream. "Excuse me?" Brenda said, her tone tightening. "The structure," I said, "isn't a tree fort anymore. It's an attached deck." Brenda's eyebrows twitched. "A deck?" "That's right," I said. "Last weekend I extended my back porch. You know, added a few boards, some railings. It just so happens that my deck now connects to the oak tree. And anything connected to the primary dwelling is, by definition, an attached structure. Section 3.1.2 of the HOA bylaws. I highlighted it for your convenience. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, high-quality, well-lit pictures showing the seamless walkway from the house to the fort. Brenda stared at them, her mouth tightening. "That's," she began, but I cut in. "Fully compliant," I said. I even used HOA-approved materials. Cedar, stained to match the neighborhood standard. "Would you like the receipts?" Mrs. Peterson's jaw dropped. Harold leaned in to examine the photos, his brow furrowing in reluctant admiration. "Looks sturdy," he murmured. Brenda shot him a look sharp enough to draw blood. "This is absurd," she said, her voice climbing an octave. "You can't just redefine things." "Sure I can," I said. "It's called interpretation. You folks love that word when it works in your favor." One of the spectators snorted, trying to hide a laugh. Brenda slammed her gavel, plastic, but she hit it hard enough to echo. "Order. This is a serious matter." "So's childhood," I said quietly. The room went silent again. Brenda's face flushed. "This isn't over," she said finally. "We'll review your so-called modifications and make a determination." "Take your time," I said, standing. "Ben and I will be on the deck." As I left the meeting, I could feel the tension radiating from Brenda's perfect posture. She wasn't just angry, she was insulted. People like Brenda don't hate losing. They hate being outsmarted. For a few days, peace returned. The deck, stood proudly attached to the house like a small symbol of defiance. Ben and I added flower boxes along the railing, just to make it look extra domestic. The neighbors began stopping by again, smiling, offering compliments. Even the mailman called it the coolest deck I've ever seen. I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd reached détente. I was wrong. A week later, I came home to find Brenda standing in my yard again, clipboard in hand, sunglasses glinting like twin shields. Behind her was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, bald, wearing a city code enforcement badge. Brenda smiled in that tight way that means she's about to ruin your day. "Afternoon, Mr. Clark," she said. "This is Officer Daniels from County Inspection. We have a few questions about your structure." I stared at the man, then at her. "You called the city?" "Of course," she said sweetly. "We just want to ensure all safety standards are being met." Daniels stepped forward, professional and polite. "Mind if I take a look, sir?" "Go ahead," I said, motioning toward the yard. He walked the perimeter, took notes, snapped pictures, and even climbed halfway up the steps. "Looks solid," he said finally. "Handrails are fine. Weight-bearing seems safe, and the attachment points are sturdy." "You used proper lag bolts. Did you get a permit?" "Technically, I didn't need one for a residential deck under a certain height," I said. He nodded. "Right. County code allows that." Brenda's smile faltered. But the tree," she sputtered. "It's in a tree." "Technically," I said, "the tree is part of the landscape, not the structure. The deck just happens to meet it." Daniels chuckled under his breath. "Well, from what I can tell, everything's compliant. Good craftsmanship, too." He closed his notebook. "No violations here." Brenda's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. "Thank you, officer," I said, suppressing a grin. As he walked away, she turned to me, trembling with indignation. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "This is bigger than you, Mr. Clark. Rules matter." "Maybe," I said. "But so does joy." Then I leaned closer, lowered my voice just enough for her to hear. "And between you and me, Brenda, joy builds better decks." She stormed off, muttering something about an appeal to the board. I stood there in the late afternoon light, watching her pastel sweater disappear behind the hedges, and felt that same quiet defiance rise again. They'd tried to humiliate me in front of the community, send officials, twist the law, but they'd forgotten one thing. I played by the same book. They just never expected anyone to actually read it. That night, after Ben went to bed, I sat out on the deck, formerly known as the Sky Den, with a flashlight and a stack of papers. The air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. I'd borrowed the HOA bylaws binder from the community website and printed the entire thing, all 72 glorious pages of suburban tyranny. It sat on the table like a sleeping dragon, waiting to be dissected. I flipped through section after section, the bureaucratic language so dense it could suffocate creativity itself. Yet buried under the jargon, I started to see something: tiny cracks in the armor, contradictions between sections, vague terms open to interpretation. I made notes, underlined phrases, highlighted loopholes like a man unearthing treasure in a graveyard of rules. The further I read, the funnier it became. Structures visible from the street must maintain harmony with existing dwellings. Harmony. That was the word Brenda loved to throw around like it meant something divine. But nowhere did it define harmony. Then came Section 8.4. Homeowners are encouraged to maintain landscaping that supports community aesthetics. Encouraged, not required. I smiled. Brenda had been enforcing personal preference disguised as law. By midnight, I had a full page of notes, a roadmap to poetic revenge. They wanted me to follow the rules? Fine. I'd follow them so perfectly that they'd regret ever writing them. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store. The guy at the lumber desk raised an eyebrow when I started describing my deck enhancement project. "So, you're adding what now?" he asked. "A pergola," I said. "Technically a decorative shade extension, with planter boxes and fairy lights, all compliant with the bylaws I checked." He chuckled. "Sounds fancy." "Oh, it's going to be legendary," I said. I spent the entire weekend transforming the Sky Den into something straight out of an architectural magazine. I added railings, a small retractable awning, built-in benches, and even a flower trellis connecting the fort to the house. It wasn't just a deck anymore. It was an outdoor living masterpiece. The best part? Every nail, every board, every design choice was fully compliant with the HOA's own rules. On Monday morning, when Brenda took her ritual power walk past my house, she froze mid-stride. Her visor tilted as she stared at the upgraded marvel before her eyes. The golden cedar gleamed under the sunlight. The flower boxes overflowed with petunias. Wind chimes tinkled softly. And there, at the center of it all, Ben sat reading a comic book under a string of solar fairy lights. I waved from my coffee chair. "Morning, Brenda. Lovely day for community aesthetics, don't you think?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stood there, clutching her phone like a detonator she wasn't sure how to use. You can't just... This wasn't approved," she finally managed. "Actually, it was," I said, holding up my phone. "Filed an improvement form last week for deck accessories. The committee approved it automatically when they didn't respond within 7 days. Section 5.9.3. Failure to reply constitutes tacit approval." Her jaw actually dropped. "That's not a loophole?" I finished for her. "No, Brenda, that's your rule. I just read it." I could see the calculation happening behind her mirrored sunglasses, the dawning horror that someone had beaten her at her own paperwork. "Enjoy your walk," I said with a smile. She turned sharply and power walked away so fast her visor nearly flew off. I sipped my coffee, savoring the victory. But I wasn't done. See, the trick to real revenge isn't just beating someone once. It's making them approve their own defeat. So, I decided to take it one step further. I filed another form. This. Time to extend the deck perimeter for community-friendly gatherings. In plain English, I was adding a barbecue grill and a picnic table. I attached a photo mock-up, carefully photoshopped to include neutral beige tones and tasteful decor, because Brenda loved tasteful. The submission went through, no questions asked. Within a week, I had the grill, the lights, and the table installed. The Sky Den had become the neighborhood's new landmark. Kids started visiting. Parents stopped by. People actually talked to each other again, instead of retreating behind beige curtains. Every evening, laughter replaced silence in the cul-de-sac. It was beautiful, and, ironically, exactly what the HOA claimed to want. Community harmony. Brenda's nightmare had become her own stated mission. Still, I knew she wouldn't give up. People like Brenda don't accept defeat. They plot comebacks. So I stayed ready. I dug deeper into the bylaws and found something even juicier. The clause about temporary installations for community engagement. It allowed any homeowner to host neighborhood events without pre-approval, as long as the event promoted goodwill. So, my brain started connecting dots like a conspiracy theorist with a corkboard. What if I hosted something in the Sky Den Deck area that met all the HOA's rules and made Brenda look bad for opposing it? That was the seed of the plan. I'd create an event so wholesome, so perfectly compliant, that the HOA couldn't possibly object, at least not without exposing themselves as the villains. That night, I told Ben, "How'd you like to host a neighborhood kids' reading day up here?" His eyes lit up. "Like a book club?" "Exactly. With cookies and lemonade. Everyone invited. HOA approved." He grinned so wide I almost forgot about the bureaucracy war. Over the next few days, we printed flyers, handed them out, and even got the local library to donate a few kids' books. I sent Brenda an official invitation, polite, formal, dripping with civility. The event was scheduled for Saturday morning. When the day came, the deck buzzed with laughter. Parents chatted, kids read aloud, and the smell of fresh cookies filled the air. Even Officer Daniels from Code Enforcement showed up, off-duty, holding a lemonade. Cameras clicked, people smiled, and the HOA's worst fear came true. Happiness was visible from the street. Brenda arrived 20 minutes late, wearing her usual pastels and an expression that could curdle milk. She stood at the edge of the lawn, hands on hips, watching as her kingdom of control slipped away. "Good turnout," I said cheerfully. "We're promoting community harmony. You'd be proud." She didn't reply. She just turned and left, her heels stabbing the grass like tiny daggers. As I watched her retreat, I realized I'd stumbled onto something powerful. This wasn't just about one tree fort anymore. It was about showing that the rules people use to control others can be the very tools that set them free, if you read them closely enough. And I wasn't finished yet. Because while Brenda sulked, I had already drafted my next form, Proposal for Official Community Gathering Space Expansion. The attached image? My deck, complete with the Sky Den perched above it, proudly labeled Observation Platform for Neighborhood Events. Revenge wasn't just coming. It was about to be HOA approved. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only happens right before a storm. Except this time, the storm was made of lemonade stands, folding chairs, and suburban gossip. By 10 o'clock, the deck was alive with laughter again. The community reading nook had officially become a weekly thing, and this time I'd added banners, planters, and a sign that said Neighborhood Harmony Zone, sponsored by HOA member Clark. That part was key. The phrase, sponsored by HOA member, made it sound official, even though I hadn't asked a soul for permission. It's amazing what a laminated sign and some clip art can do to neutralize opposition. Brenda appeared 20 minutes later, naturally. She stood across the street with her clipboard, scanning the scene like a detective at a crime scene made of joy. Kids giggled from the tree fort, the observation platform, and parents chatted near the grill. One of them, Mr. Harris, called out to her, "Hey, Brenda, you coming to grab a cookie?" Brenda's smile was the kind people wear when they're trying not to scream. She waved stiffly and crossed over, heels clicking like punctuation marks. "Mr. Clark," she said through clenched teeth, "I received your proposal for community space expansion. We'll be reviewing it at the next meeting." "Wonderful," I said. "Just thought it'd be nice to give back. You know, build connection, promote goodwill, like the bylaws suggest." "You are remarkably well-versed in our policies," she said. "Oh, I read them nightly now," I said. "They're riveting." Her jaw twitched. "You can't weaponize our rules against us, Mr. Clark." "Sure I can," I said softly. "You wrote them." She blinked, turned to leave, then stopped halfway up the sidewalk as a photographer from the local paper snapped a picture of the event. I hadn't invited him. He'd heard about it from the library's social media post. The caption the next day read, "Neighborhood unites over DIY reading deck. A father and son bring joy to Willow Bend." The photo showed Ben reading to a group of kids while fairy lights twinkled above. I was in the background, laughing with a lemonade cup in hand. Brenda, unfortunately for her, was in the far corner of the frame, scowling. The image went modestly viral on local Facebook groups. Comments poured in. "What a wonderful community. That's the kind of neighborhood spirit we need." Finally, something positive about an HOA. For once, the HOA was popular, and Brenda hated every second of it. Within a week, half the board was basking in the unearned glow of community approval. They started referring to the deck as a pilot success project. Even Harold the treasurer suggested we add it to the next newsletter. Brenda tried to object, but democracy can be cruel. The motion passed 4-1. I should have stopped there. I'd already won. But revenge has momentum. It's a quiet thrill that doesn't know when to quit. So I decided to make sure Brenda's empire of beige control would never rise again. I called for an official neighborhood vote. According to Section 11.3.1, any HOA member could propose a community improvement project if they gathered signatures from at least 25% of homeowners. My petition? Convert the Clark Deck into official community recreation area. I walked door to door, clipboard in hand, smiling and explaining that it was purely symbolic, a way to encourage family gatherings. By the time I hit the 20th house, people were signing without even reading. They'd all seen the newspaper article. To them, I wasn't a troublemaker anymore. I was the guy who brought joy to Willow Bend. By Friday, I had 38 signatures, more than enough. I submitted them at Brenda's doorstep, neatly stapled, with a cover page that read, "Per your request for order and harmony." She didn't answer the door, but I heard the blinds shift. At the next HOA meeting, Brenda looked like she hadn't slept in days. The turnout was massive, standing room only. Parents, kids, retirees, even the mailman showed up. It felt less like a meeting and more like a coronation. Brenda tried to keep order, but the crowd was already buzzing. "Mr. Clark," she said finally, her voice thin as glass, "your petition has been reviewed. The board finds it technically valid." Harold cleared his throat. "And popular," he added. "Extremely popular." The crowd clapped. Brenda's gavel hit the table. "Order! This is not a carnival." "No," I said, standing. "It's a community." I handed out printed copies of my proposal to the room. It outlined everything: shared maintenance, safety measures, event guidelines. All clean, legal, airtight. The board couldn't find a single clause to reject it. "I've followed every rule," I said. "And I've done exactly what this HOA was founded to do. Make neighbors care about each other." Brenda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I could almost see the moment she realized she'd lost not just a battle, but the entire narrative. The vote passed 5-0, unanimous. Even Brenda, outnumbered, had to raise her hand. The applause was thunderous. Kids cheered. Someone actually shouted, "Long live the deck!" For the first time in years, Willow Bend felt alive. Later that night, I stood out on the deck with Ben, watching the sunset. The neighborhood shimmered gold, the air soft and forgiving. "Dad," he said, "does this mean we won?" I looked down at him, then out at the rows of identical houses, now lit with laughter instead of resentment. "I don't think it was about winning," I said. "It was about remembering that rules are supposed to protect joy, not destroy it." He nodded, then grinned. "Can we add a slide now?" I laughed. "We might need another form for that." We both burst out laughing. The sound drifted across the street, where I caught sight of Brenda standing in her window, her silhouette stiff against the curtain. She couldn't stop me anymore. Not legally, not socially, not morally. Her crusade for uniformity had backfired so hard it created the most colorful, united version of this neighborhood it had ever seen. The next day, the HOA newsletter went out. On the front page, a picture of my deck with the headline, "Community Spotlight, a Space for Togetherness." The byline read, "Article contributed by President Brenda Hollingsworth." I nearly spit my coffee when I saw it. Either she'd been forced to take credit for it, or she'd done it herself to save face. Either way, it was perfect. That night, as the string lights swayed in the breeze and Ben's laughter echoed through the oaks, I realized revenge didn't have to be loud or cruel. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is forcing your enemy to celebrate your victory as their own achievement. And somewhere inside that perfect irony, I finally found peace. That night, with the neighborhood finally breathing the kind of easy air I hadn't heard there since I moved in, I walked the perimeter of the deck with a mug of something too strong for bedtime and felt the world settle into its new, slightly unpredictable orbit. The sky above the oaks was a bruised blue, the fairy lights blinking like small, deliberate stars, and Ben was already asleep inside with his comic book folded under his pillow, dreaming of pirate ships and space forts as if nothing monumental had happened at all, which, of course, to him, it hadn't. This had always just been the place where his dad could make the kind of magic that tastes like peanut butter and permission. Yet everything had shifted in a way that felt both enormous and quietly domestic, as if the neighborhood had rearranged itself around a single idea. People matter more than rules when those rules forget why they exist. In the days that followed the unanimous vote and the newspaper photo that had tilted public sentiment like a nudge against a row of dominoes, Willow Bend looked different. The beige facades didn't change color. Thankfully, no one wanted that. But the way people lingered on porches did. Morning greetings grew longer. The old man who'd always driven his riding mower like a man conducting an orchestra actually stopped his mower, sat on my picnic bench, and told me stories about his own kids climbing trees in a small town 20 years earlier. The Patel family started bringing fresh samosas for weekend gatherings, and Mrs. Peterson, the very same woman who used to sniff disapproval, like a skunk sniffs a lamp, brought a bowl of lemon bars to the first open, maintenance day, and apologized in a way that sounded almost ashamed, like someone admitting they had once tried to stop a parade and then joined it instead. Brenda, in her pastel armor, didn't vanish so much as wither. She retreated into the narrow channels of protocol where she felt safe, sending stiff emails with copied-by lists and italicized phrases. But her power to make people's lives miserable had been surgically reduced by one simple thing. Everyone could now see the outcome of humane rules: life, laughter, intergenerational noise, and they liked it better than the quiet, sterilized obedience she'd been selling. There are two ways to lose authority: spectacularly, like in a scandal, or slowly, like when your reasons stop making sense. Brenda chose the latter and discovered it is slower to anger and longer to recover from. She still held the title, and she still chaired the meetings, but the meetings themselves became less like tribunals and more like neighborhood potlucks. At the next quarterly board, she read aloud the minutes in a voice that tried to convey control, while the room barely masked its smiles. Harold the treasurer read the financials, and then, illicitly, charming, proposed a small annual stipend for community enrichment, which translated into buying new library, books, and repairing the community center's noisy air conditioner. The vote was, of course, unanimous. I watched Brenda sign the check. Her hand trembled once, the way hands do when someone who's built a life on being right realizes that the world doesn't owe them obedience. For me, revenge had never been about punishment. It was an experiment in turning rigidity into generosity. I wanted the bylaws to be instruments of community, not cudgels. I wanted to show that the language of governance could be reread in the service of warmth, because anyone can call something a rule. But it takes a certain kind of courage to make a rule mean something good. Over the following months, Willow Bend found its own rhythm. The deck became a legitimate public space. Baby showers under a string of lights, book clubs where retirees argued over dystopian metaphors, and teens pretended to be bored but stayed anyway. 4th of July barbecues where someone always burned the burgers and nobody cared. Ben grew more fearless. He hosted a DIY robotics day, where kids soldered vaguely dangerous things under the careful supervision of a retired engineer 2 houses down. And at the end of summer, a small army of kids marched my veritable megadeck like it was a ship, waving cardboard swords and singing off-key sea shanties. He kept his "No Brendas Allowed" sign for a while, then repainted it into "Everyone's Welcome," which felt like the ultimate small victory, an admission that he'd won something bigger than a spat with a neighbor. He'd helped reshape the place he lived into somewhere that fit him better. On a practical note, the HOA learned the cost-benefit math of being flexible. Membership satisfaction ticked up, complaints decreased, and the community's property values stabilized in that comfortable upward slope realtors like to show in slideshows. People started inviting each other over unprompted again, which is a civilizational miracle in our age of curated schedules. We didn't throw Brenda out of office. There was no need, because that would have felt petty, and I had no appetite for pyrotechnics. Instead, I watched as she adapted in small human ways. She signed up to chair a new neighborhood wellness committee that, to her credit, she executed with the same obsessive detail she'd applied to policing paint colors. But now it focused on food drives and an annual kids' art show. The art show was the best part. Paintings of tree forts, collages of community potlucks, a clay sculpture titled "The Great Deck of Willow Bend" that looked like a joyful paperweight. Brenda smiled at the reception, and while the smile was guarded, it was genuine enough to sting in a good way, like when someone you believed irredeemable turns out to be complicated and capable of better. I won't pretend the transition was cinematic in the way movies edit time. There were missteps, glares that lasted too long, a couple of pettier rule citations filed by cranky homeowners who liked drama. But the dominant narrative shifted. The bylaws, those 72 pages I'd once printed and devoured like a man hunting for treasure, began to look less like a grimoire of command and more like a set of tools. People read them not to find a way to shame a neighbor, but to figure out how to fix a problem, how to build a safe railing, how to host a gathering without eliciting noise complaints, how to help an elderly neighbor with yard work. The most satisfying moment came unexpectedly on a Tuesday evening when the mail carrier, who had been our unofficial historian of the cul-de-sac, knocked on the deck and handed me a letter from a family who wanted to move into Willow Bend. They wrote about being drawn by the sense of community and the pictures of kids playing on a deck that doubled as a library and a fortress and a stage. "We want to be part of that," they wrote, not despite the HOA, but because of it. I kept that letter in a drawer for weeks. taking it out when the nights felt long and the work of keeping a small corner of the world humane felt heavy. It reminded me that small civic acts have long tails, that rearranging expectations in one block can ripple outward into the lives of families who need a place where neighbors are more than silhouettes behind curtains. There were quieter personal victories, too. I got a promotion at work, which seemed unrelated, until I realized it gave me more time and flexibility to actually be present for Ben, to bring him to the library events he loved, and to drive him to soccer practice without the constant gnawing of calendar conflicts. My relationship with my ex, the mother of Ben, improved in the way that matters. We talked less about custody and more about how our son was finding the kind of childhood we'd both wanted for him. We shared a few breakfasts on the deck like a truce that felt more honest than apology. As for Ben, he grew up believing that a father can take a piece of wood, some nails, and a ridiculous idea and turn it into a kind of civic poetry. He learned that rules are not monsters if you learn to read them, and, more importantly, that most people respond to kindness faster than they do to scorn. One afternoon, a few years later, he took me aside and said in a voice that was part matter-of-fact and part wonder, "Dad, remember when you made that deck? That was awesome. Can we build a treehouse with solar panels now?" I looked at him, taller, hands calloused from tinkering, eyes bright, and felt the sweep of a life I hadn't planned, but had, in the best ways, built. "We'll do it right," I told him, and he laughed and bounded off to sketch plans. That, perhaps, was the most important closure. The idea that our small rebellion had seeded a future where kids could make things without fearing paperwork would crush their impulses to create. When people ask me now, years later, whether I regret any of it, whether the weeks of friction were worth the eventual peace, I tell them honestly, the unease was part of the cost of making the place my son would inherit slightly better than the one I had. There were evenings when I lay awake and worried that I'd misread the bylaws, or that Brenda would find a new clause and retaliate. But those nights were fewer than the mornings spent sipping coffee, while the sun warmed the cedar boards. My friends joke that I became the sort of man who reads legalese for fun. And maybe I did. At least enough to know that rules are human tools, and humans can always choose to wield them with charity or cruelty. The deck still stands, weathered now at the edges, the wood patinaed by summers and small storms. Someone occasionally forgets to repaint a slat, and I let them because perfection was never the point. Children still hang from its railings, laughing, their voices a chorus that drowns out the itch for uniformity. Brenda moved to a smaller role on the board after 8 years. Not because anyone forced her, but because she finally admitted, to herself more than anyone else, that she enjoyed planning potlucks more than policing paint. We sat on the deck once as autumn gilded the oaks, and she brought a pie. She said, oddly, "I suppose you were right about community being useful." I handed her a napkin and told her crust was underbaked, which is the kind of small cruelty neighbors can forgive each other for. She laughed, a true laugh, and the sound surprised both of us. Maybe the final poetic justice is simpler than dramatic. It was never about humiliation or triumphalism, but about nudging a small corner of the world toward its better angels. The bylaws that once felt like a cudgel turned into scaffolding for warmth. The man who read every clause didn't become a martyr or a celebrity. He became a neighbor who could be counted on to bring cookies and to fix a loose step when the weather ate one. And Ben, well, Ben grew into a decent human who knows how to build and how to forgive. He knows also that sometimes the most effective revolution is the one that invites everyone to the table and then makes sure there's enough lemonade. So yeah, maybe harmony isn't beige after all. They wanted order. I gave them legend. If you liked this little suburban mutiny and want to hear more stories where small rebellions turn into better lives, hit subscribe and come sit on the deck with us. There's always room for one more mug of coffee and one more ridiculous idea.